Vintage inspired versus vintage fashion. What's the difference? Is there a difference? Can we agree on those differences if we have differences? Hopefully the answer is yes. Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Gibson with Kaleidoscopes and Polka Dots, where I sell handmade vintage inspired jewelry for the soul that's in love with the past, wholeheartedly lives in the present, and embraces the future. If you enjoy videos relating to vintage fashion, jewelry, and books, please stick around so that you never miss an episode. So earlier this year, I took part in the Vintage Fashion Challenge. It's an Instagram challenge where you're given a prompt, you post an outfit video, and you sort of follow the prompt, right? So I started off quite strong. I posted a few vintage inspired outfits, yet I couldn't help but notice that a lot of these ladies were incredibly good at emulating the aesthetic that was being prompted, whereas I was just flying by the seat of my pants. I was following the prompts, however, my perspective seemed quite different to theirs. And as I've come to realize, the more I learn, the more I know. And it has to do with our interpretation of vintage. It relates to vintage versus vintage inspired. I'm in the vintage inspired category, and they were all just beautifully decked out vintage gals. So I felt like I was having an existential crisis because I've always considered myself a vintage gal, although admittedly, I don't have any vintage. This piece behind me is the most vintage item that I own. It was gifted to me by my mother-in-law. Well, it was really gifted to my husband. Let's get into the differences. So Wikipedia defines vintage as a colloquialism that is commonly used to refer to clothing that is old. Is that really good enough for you? I didn't think so. So I went on my merry way and I consulted a few other blogs. And the one that really spoke to me was one from Shannon Latici. I hope I pronounced that right, Shannon. I'm very sorry. She is from Shop Lee McGee, and she, in a blog post titled, "What Makes Vintage? One Seller's Thoughts," she says, "The generally accepted industry standard is that anything made in the last 100 years is antique. Anything made in the last 20 years, nearly 2000s, is vintage. That makes an 80-year window, which encompasses a huge change in the global fashion scape." Ashley Kane from liveabout.com also wrote a blog post titled, "What is the definition of vintage clothing?" And she notes, "The term vintage is used to describe clothing between 20 and 100 years old. That is also clearly representative of the era in which it was produced. It could be said that to be called vintage, the piece should strongly reflect styles and trends associated with that era." Do you agree? I think that's a pretty good definition. Now, both Shannon and Ashley work in clothing, but if you asked designers, home designers, what vintage means, they focus on completely different things. They focus on the feel, on the aesthetic, on creating a space that feels vintage. I found this beautiful YouTube video from One Kings Lane titled "One Kings Lane, What is Vintage?" where they consulted a number of their tastemakers as far as what their definition of vintage was. One of them was Peter Dunham, and he says, "It's a great open word, vintage. You know, it really represents things that you find, the serendipity of the found object." And another one is Malcolm Kuttner, where he says, "There is a sort of a one-line definition, and it does come down to, it's a point of view. It's about personality. It's about an energy." I agree. Both of you are right. However, what does that mean? Does that mean my vintage inspired pieces are vintage because they feel vintage? Hopefully. My own definition of vintage has been something that has been used and loved by someone older and wiser than myself. Naturally, things take on a representation of the era because they were made in a certain time with certain skill sets, with certain things in mind. The world was a different place. Everything was different just 10 years ago, and things made 10 years ago have a certain feel and aesthetic. So that is my definition of vintage. It's used, it's loved, and it is representative of a certain era, just naturally. What do you think? Am I onto something, or is this a cop-out? Because it may very well be, because I don't want to get into too much of an argument over this. This video was inspired because I have heard Rachel Mackey, who I've come to love and recently discovered, and I have since discovered so many other creators because of her video, Vintage Fashion, Not Vintage Values, so good. I will have it linked down below. In her videos, she often mentions that people criticize her for not being vintage enough, and that she has strayed away from vintage because of that heavy criticism. But after pouring myself into internet research, what I come to find out is that it's really hard to really nail down its definition, given that so many different people in different industries have different definitions for this very, very complex word or topic. I mean, it feels complex and very polarizing, especially for that person that is determined to make the aesthetic as representative as possible. That person that invests their time, energy, and money into making sure that they are following everything to the T of that era, of that time. I commend them for that. I cannot imagine myself doing that. I'm just not that person. I can sit down and bead to the best of my ability, to the best detail possible, but to pour over tiny details like the placement and the whatever, the veneer, anything, so closely and delicately, it just seems overwhelming and frankly not something that I'm interested in pursuing, at least not at this point. Probably never. I am not that person, unfortunately. I know a lot of you are probably not in that category, because from what I could tell in Rachel's comment section, a lot of people were very accepting and loving of her aesthetic and her vibe. I didn't want to go forward calling myself a vintage gal when I saw such a disparity between my fashion and the fashion of these vintage challenge influencers. They are incredibly gifted in emulating those eras, and they have such an incredible collection. I can only dream of it one day having half of the pieces that these beautiful women had, but oh no, it wasn't just women. They were just all over the place, fabulous. Let's get back to vintage inspired. Let's define vintage inspired, because ultimately that's where I fall. Sources such as Wikipedia define vintage inspired as items that are mass produced, generally in China, and that lack that attention to detail that is most commonly seen in vintage pieces. However, I was very astounded when I found that the popular blog Vintage Dancer defines vintage inspired as specifically new vintage style with clothing most likely from the 30s to the 70s. That is very specific. What about 80s, 90s? I question that. However, I appreciate it. I appreciate that they take this stance. Makes me wonder, when was this blog written? I couldn't find a date, so I can't tell you. I tend to agree with Wikipedia. It's something that is generally thought of as mass-produced and that lacks that attention to detail that we most commonly fall in love with relating to vintage style. But is there others? Definitions. Yes, graphic designers. You guys have another definition, and it kind of relates to that of the interior designers. In an article by 99 Designs, a design platform titled Vintage Design Tips and Inspiration to Master the Trend by Lindsay Kramer, she notes, the term vintage is often understood to mean actual design and items that were produced in the past, whereas retro is typically used to refer to modern designs that emulate these older designs. I think that's very, very close to what my own interpretation of vintage inspired is. By the way, vintage inspired, retro style, and modern vintage all seem to have the same definition. I will probably go into it in another video in the future, because I think that it's deserving of clarity, at least in my head, because I need to understand what I'm talking about. With all of that said, I would argue that most of us would probably agree that a vintage piece is something that comes from a different time, that was manufactured in a different time, and that is representative of that era. Vintage inspired is something that emulates the past and is made with modern equipment and generally mass produced and of lesser quality generally. because there's also such a thing as handmade vintage inspired, and that's what I sell. So that is why it was important to me also to define the differences between vintage inspired, and how I can differentiate my brand from that stigma. My pieces are handmade at this time. They're all handmade by me and created, thought up of, by me. By the way, I want to come up with a better definition for vintage versus vintage inspired. And if you have definitions for modern, vintage, and retro style, I would love to hear those as well. Leave them in the comment section. I would love to know. That is it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you again very soon. Bye. This is the most vintage item. Oh god. Vintage inspired is modern made. I would love to start a conversation in the comment section.